and welcome to Box, a Formula One podcast. I am Valtteri Bottas's ass, Shannon Hayes.
I'm Lawrence Stroll's yellow teeth, Sam Cockcroft.
And I'm George's missed episode, Merel Huseman.
So today's episode of Box is going to be a little bit different than usual. This week, just due to the fact that Merel was moving and Sam was quite busy, we weren't able to all get together to record at the same time. So instead, we decided that the easiest way to do this would just be to each sort of record individually and then splice that together afterwards. This week, we're going to be talking mostly about Drive to Survive, which obviously just dropped this past Friday. So very exciting stuff. I think Sam did not have the chance to watch all of it, so she is going to start in our, I guess, kind of spoiler-free section and give her thoughts on the first couple of episodes or so. And then after that, Merel and I are probably going to give a more overall view of how the newest season of Drive to Survive went and our thoughts on that. So, I think once Sam's section ends, we will give a fair little spoiler warning. And if you haven't finished the season yet and you don't want any spoilers of what's to come, you can just turn off the pod there and maybe come back to it later after you finish the season, because we will be getting into spoiler territory, I guess. Before we get into that, though, I wanted to discuss some of the news of the week, just something that kind of interested me. There was some backlash on Twitter recently regarding Lando Norris and some stuff that he said during a Twitch stream this past weekend. Basically, he and a friend were talking about girls, and they were referring to Lando as, like, Mr. Steal Your Girl, and saying that, like, you know, he had stolen one of the other guy's girls. It was mainly just banter between these guys, but the thing that people were pushing back on was the fact that they were being objectifying in their language. And I do agree with that to an extent. When they were referring to these girls, they were referring to them as, like, that one or this one, and they were referring to multiple women. So when you hear that, it just kind of sounds like regular dude bro douchebaggy college guy talk, and, you know, sort of puffing your chest out and being like, oh, I've had, like, this many women, you know, I could steal your girl, you know. And so when you hear that, it is objectifying, and I understand why his fans, especially younger fans of his, were upset. I think that he has a lot of younger female followers who can tend to put these men on pedestals and think that they're these bastions of, like, you know, liberal feminism just because they say that, like, they love their mom and they love women in public, but then in these not private scenarios, but, you know, male dominated scenarios, they might act a bit differently and puff their chest out. But then on the other side of that coin, I don't think it's the worst thing that's been said on a Twitch stream by far, and certainly not the worst thing done by a Formula One driver. Some of the backlash seems a bit unfounded to me, and even people on Twitter were apparently comparing him to Nikita Mazepin, which is just such a far reach. I don't really know what planet you have to be on to try to compare a recorded act of sexual assault to someone, you know, just using kind of objectifying language. It's a bit absurd altogether, the whole scenario. I think that it's good at least that we are talking about these things, but again, I think some of the pushback is a bit much. You know, Lando is obviously a public figure, not only because of his role in Formula One, but also as a Twitch streamer with a large following. And I think that having these conversations is good because he should recognize the full extent and reach of his voice. And, you know, with this kind of huge following, you know, he is still quite immature, and he does still kind of act like that 21-year-old douchebag type that I think we've all met in college or, you know, just in our lives. And maybe this could be a learning moment to maybe see that, you know, language does hurt people, and it does matter. And even if, obviously, I don't think his intent was to sound like a super misogynist. I think he was just talking about this subject with his friends and didn't want to give any actual identifying features of these women, so he kept saying that one, the one with the etc., that kind of stuff. But like it is a bit hurtful, and especially if you're a young Lando fan and you hear that and you're like, oh well. I do also want to point out that I think it is interesting that we are even having this discussion in the first place, and I think some of that has to do with the fact that his friend on the stream, I don't know his name, was sort of pushing back on the topic. He seemed like he didn't want to talk about it because his own personal reasons. He just didn't want to talk about Lando stealing his girl or whatever. But just that like little pushback, I think, demonstrates how powerful men's voices can be when it comes to these kinds of discussions. I think that people in general are always talking about how men can be good allies by sticking up for women in these sorts of scenarios where maybe it is just locker room talk, and maybe this isn't the exact scenario where, where men always have to, speak up and say it, but, I think it's an interesting point to draw that just because this one guy pushed back, it sort of brought this to the forefront of the discussion that he was using objectifying language and people were not comfortable with that. And I don't know that that necessarily would have happened if it had just continued as like fun banter between the lads and no one had pushed back at all. Granted, obviously I don't think his friend was pushing back for the sake of like feminism or whatever. I think he was pushing back because he just genuinely didn't want to talk about it. But I think having that tension in the conversation is kind of what highlighted it to people. And so I think it highlights a good note that, like, men to truly be good allies, they do have this power and they can open these discussions. And again, maybe this isn't the most important use for that power, but it's just an interesting thing to note, I think. Overall, I don't think Lando is some super misogynist. I don't think he needs to be canceled. I listened to the clip. It just sounded like any kind of douchey 21-year-old guy, which is, obviously disappointing to people that are super fans of his and like run the fan pages and stuff. But I mean, I can't say it's out of the norm or what I expected. I think that we see this kind of language a lot from especially people involved in live streaming and sports in general. So, Lando fits both of those. He's right at the center of that Venn diagram. He was probably suspect number one for someone who would be using this language, right? And it's not the worst language in the world either. I think that, he was probably just using more of this to protect women's identities. Some of it was a bit cringeworthy, but overall it's really not the worst. And I think that like just the little slap on the wrist and the discussion is good. But certainly, we shouldn't be comparing him to Nikita Mazepin. That's just absolutely ridiculous. All right. And now why don't we get into some thoughts on Drive to Survive. I think we'll be opening with Sam in the spoiler-free portion. Spoilers in quotes, as if you haven't watched the 2020 season yourself. And then we'll be moving on to Merel and then me.
Hello everyone, this is Sam recording my take on Drive to Survive Season 3 so far. Unlike Merel and a large population of Formula One fans, I am in midterms right now, so I've only been able to watch one episode. Normally when I watch TV, it is in the background and I'm not paying very much attention, but I feel like Drive to Survive really deserves my undivided attention, which is why I've only been able to watch one episode so far. I'm hoping in the next episodes that I will be able to maybe live tweet my thoughts, but for the moment I'm just going to share some of my thoughts on the first episode and what I'm looking forward to in the rest of the season. So I was watching the first episode and immediately had so many thoughts that I wanted to text Merel and Shannon, so I ended up just like writing down this list of things that I was thinking. As we know, I think the first episode mostly focuses on Racing Point and their testing and start to the season, especially in regards to their car for 2020, which was essentially a 2019 Mercedes. And then also kind of touching on, obviously, the start of COVID and the canceling of the Australian Grand Prix in 2020. But just to start off, I feel like I haven't seen enough of Lawrence Stroll and, like, his actual personality, and all I have to say is he's just way more aggressive than I thought he was going to be. Like, who is he trying to scare? Like, why is he trying to come off as this really scary, dominant person? I'm just not really sure. It was kind of shocking and not exactly what I was maybe expecting from his personality. But then again, he did buy a Formula One team essentially for his son. So are we surprised? No, I guess I shouldn't be surprised. It was also really good to see a little bit more of Otmar, the Racing Point team principal, because I feel like he is always just in the background. I feel like we see way more of Cyril and Christian Horner and Binotto, obviously, and Toto. So there's just really never enough coverage of Otmar, and it was really nice to see him and learn a little bit more about him and how long he's actually been at Racing Point, because I thought that was really interesting. Yeah, I mean, just the whole Racing Point thing was great. I wish there was a little bit more Checo, but it was nice to see Lance, because I guess I'm like a Lance Stroll fan now. I don't know. I don't hate him as much as I used to, and I think his little line of saying, like, it's the confidence that makes me a good driver, I thought was actually really adorable, the way he was talking about it. Normally, I feel like in the past that line would have really just pissed me off. But, you know, he's a decent driver. It's a little weird that his dad bought him the team, but what can you do? Billionaires be billionaires. I also feel like I need to touch on the fact that both Lance and Lawrence have some yellow looking teeth. That's it. Like, I don't understand. Like, I guess, do you, whatever. No, I feel like I'm in no place to critique. I don't have the best looking teeth either, whatever. But this man is literally a billionaire. He has $1 billion and he can't pay for some quality whitening. I don't know. That's my take. Short quote from Will Buxton that I thought was funny. He said the drivers only have 3 days to test the car, talking about 2020 testing. Little did everyone know that 2021 testing was not only going to be in Bahrain, but also only going to be 3 days. So most drivers only got about a day and a half at max. Some drivers way less than that. So I think that'll provide an interesting look at this coming season. But I just thought it was funny that they were talking about how little time that is, and now, you know, little did they know this was what was coming. I think the other things that I thought were really great about the episode was we already got way more Lando Norris than we did in all of the past seasons of Drive to Survive. I think in this one episode there was more of him than there was in like both of the past 2 seasons. So that was really, really great to see a little bit more of him. Yeah, I mean, he's a great driver, and he had a good season last season, so I'm looking forward to seeing a little bit more of him. And the McLaren team. And Alex Albon only had the like smallest scene in this episode, but I was already so sad that we're not going to see him in this coming season of Drive to Survive for the 2021 season. I already miss him on the grid so much. I hope he comes back. I hope Alex comes back. And I think obviously this episode was like the beginning of COVID, and I think all of their COVID jokes about like them not really taking it seriously aged so poorly. And I feel like we could give them shit about that, but also I was saying the exact same thing during that time in March. I was literally about to go to Spain, and I was like, yeah, I mean, like, it's bad there. It's not gonna come here. The naivety. Oh my gosh. I think they were in definitely a little bit worse situation, I think, in Australia at that weekend. Lewis was super blunt about how stupid it was that they were having a race that weekend and criticizing the FIA, which Lewis has always been outspoken about those kinds of things, and I just think, you know, he was right. Cash is king, man. Wow. The fact that he said that in the interview, I think, was really crazy. I definitely missed that last season. And I think everyone was so pissed about it, talking about how they, like, wanted their money back and how the season is fucked and, like, this is just, like, a total disaster. But looking at where we are now, I think it's super clear that canceling Australia was the right choice. I'm just, like, can't even imagine what the, like, outcome would have been had Australia gone as planned at that point. But yeah, I mean, those are pretty much my thoughts on the first episode. I really liked it. I still find it super, super weird watching Drive to Survive and getting this really serious look at the drivers in Formula One that's super dramatic, especially being so used to watching YouTube videos and seeing funny driver interviews and those kinds of things. I did like how they opened up the season with all of them doing their, like, testing and, like, pre-season photo shoots and stuff like that of them walking on the track, and you could see them, like, all not taking it seriously and having a good laugh. So I thought that was a really funny way to actually, like, show that there is a less dramatic side to F1 than what the show is always trying to show. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to the rest of the season. I've heard there's some great parts about Bottas and just their coverage, I guess, of Grosjean's crash and things like that. Just looking forward to the rest of the season, though I have to say I'm, like, super disappointed in Netflix for not including time about George Russell's secure race, because I know personally that was the highlight of the season, and I think for a lot of people that was the highlight of the season. I think I also remember them specifically saying that weekend that Mercedes was going to have the Netflix crew following them around that weekend, and I just don't understand. If Mercedes had the Netflix crew, where's all the footage? Netflix, explain. Just wondering. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the first episode, and I am looking forward to watching the rest of it. You can follow me on Twitter if you want to see my live tweets. It is salmon_sandwich on Twitter. See everybody next week for the Australia. Wow, that's not right. For the Bahrain Grand Prix. Looking forward to an exciting start of the season. Have a good week, everyone.
Hello, everyone. This is my Merel's part of this episode that is a little bit of a mess, mostly because of me. I thought this season of Drive to Survive was amazing. I'm sure everyone else felt the same. But I think they definitely missed out on so many good things that they could have really covered. Like, obviously, George's episode. I don't know why they completely kept out his stint in the Mercedes. I feel like that would have... You know what I think, actually? I think that they're holding all this footage back, and then they're going to drop, like, mid-season, they're going to drop a George episode. I think that's what's going to happen. Maybe it's just me hoping. But, you know, who knows? Maybe they actually will. Apart from that travesty, I love the way that they did it in terms of having, like, focusing on specific drivers for episodes. I mean, maybe we got to learn a little bit too much about Valtteri and the sauna episode. But I thought it was great to see... I don't know, to see a little bit of a more personal side from all these drivers. I really loved that. I started taking notes, and then I just got engulfed by the episodes, so I don't have too many notes, but I think I kind of have started to love Racing Point, and I don't know how this like came about, because Racing Point was definitely not my top team. I think it was safe to say that it was actually at the bottom of my list in 2019, especially with Stroll and his dad. But watching this season, I've like really come to love them, and it's really fucking weird. I don't know where it came from. And I don't know. I know we didn't see this in Drive to Survive, but I feel like I need to say it, is that the Stroll Vettel partnership is like father-son. It just seems like they're bonding so well. And I guess that's kind of why I've started to love them. Oh, but on the Stroll point, every time Lance walked in anywhere in any of the episodes, it was specifically like episode 5, I think, where it was more about what was going on with the team. He was like walking in. They had him walk in, but they would put like hype music behind him in slow-mo, and I just thought it was the greatest thing. So good, so funny. I think another heartwarming thing was, I mean, we got to see this in person, but Gasly's comeback in episode 6, and like how after the downfall from Red Bull, he like picked it back up again. And I mean, you know, it was good to see Gasly start doing well again, but it was kind of 10 times worse to see Albano doing so poorly. Especially because we know what the outcome was. And then, I mean, after that, I stopped taking notes because obviously after that was Grosjean's incident and stuff like that. But it was just so funny. Another thing I thought was very, very, very funny was when, oh yeah, in episode 4, when Gunther is like trying to find a flight to, I don't know even what, from the US somewhere to one of the GPs. He's talking to Perez about how he has to like hop over and then like stop over twice or something. Then Perez is like, oh, like, why don't you just come in my private jet? It was just so funny because there was just that, and then nothing happened after that. That was just like a clip that they inserted, and I thought it was the most amazing thing. Also, like, props to Perez. The whole season, like, you could just see how hard it was actually what it was for him. And I guess that's another thing that I loved about Drive to Survive, is that you got to see, you know, their home life. We got to see a bit of his family and stuff like that, and it's just hard to remember sometimes that they actually have lives, and you know, they're not just speedy drivers. Yeah, I don't know. Lastly, I think they kind of slammed the Carlando bromance in this season. Like I feel like they kind of made it seem like 2019 season was better because in terms of like how they, you know, interacted with each other, because Lando was a newbie, and that now because he wasn't any longer, it was different. But I don't know, man. They kind of slammed them. I didn't like to see that. One thing I also did want to touch on was the last episode where, you know, Netflix kind of showed Lewis's story and the struggle of being the only black person on the grid, and you know, the road to F1, what that kind of entailed for him, and how hard and difficult it was getting to where he is now, which I think it was amazing that you know, they included that, and to show also how, you know, Lewis is using his voice with such a big audience, you know, that he's actually doing that. But I do think that Netflix, I mean, if you haven't seen the last episode, trigger warning, because they actually do show a clip of George Floyd's murder. And I mean, Netflix doesn't give any sort of trigger warning for that. They don't give any sort of, you know, warning as you're watching it. It just comes up all of a sudden. I was definitely not expecting a graphic scene like that. So it kind of felt like they used it a little bit as shock factor. I don't feel like in that scene it was very necessary to show George Floyd's death. I think we all know what's been going on in the US right now, and I mean all over the world. And you know, the importance of Formula One to be standing behind the Black Lives Matter movement. I think it's very important. But to use that scene as they did, I think was definitely for shock fact. Instead of being like, yeah, F1 stands behind the Black community, and we stand with Black Lives Matter and the movement. Instead of saying that outright, they just decided to show George Floyd's murder. And I don't know, I just think that there's a very fine line between using that and saying, we stand with Lewis, we stand with the Black community, and then over just outright saying that, And I think here what they really did is just, kind of use that clip as shock factor. And it just really surprised me that they didn't even use a trigger warning or anything, because but I just think they could have done that in a different way and showed how Lewis is using his platform, or even, maybe touch upon the fact that the FIA decided to investigate the fact that Lewis was wearing, one of Breonna Taylor's shirts. And I think that's something that they could have gone into instead of, showing George Floyd's murder. So, I don't know. I think that there definitely could have been a different way, a different approach for Netflix there. But I did think it was important that they did highlight Lewis's real story, like the fact that, F1 and the F1 community is still very white, male obviously dominated. And for Lewis to use his platform in that way, to be able to inspire younger people of color and to let them know, it's hard, but you can get there, I think was very important. Now, obviously, the thing that needs to change is not that Lewis is doing this, but that the whole Formula One grid and everyone involved in F1 does this. And I think that we've seen that this is, that's very, very hard. And we see that too in terms of, getting female drivers or women on the grid. That's also not going to happen anytime soon. Doesn't mean that we can't fight for that. And that's why we have this podcast. But that was just something that I wanted to point out, that it was very important that Netflix made Lewis's voice be heard, and not only Lewis's voice, but also the Black community's voice. And I think that's very important, and definitely good that they did that, but there's a way to approach this that, doesn't necessarily have to belittle the situation, which in my opinion they did a little bit, and use it for shock factor. That's just my opinion. I definitely think it's good that they didn't skip over this, and that they did call action on this. But yeah, that's just my opinion. I don't know. My thoughts are all over the place right now. Still, I literally watched it in one sitting. It was back-to-back episodes. No stopping me. Over to whoever's speaking next. Peace out. Sorry for this weird and jumbled episode. It's because I'm recording from Holland. Bye.
So this season of Drive to Survive, to me, was certainly interesting. I really liked the first 2 or 3 episodes of it a lot. I think that they focused on really interesting topics, and I'm glad that we have to open talking about Botas. Hashtag Botas. They did a Valtteri Bottas ass reveal in episode 3, and naturally everyone lost their shit. I can't imagine the confidence on the man who goes to a Finnish spa with his buddy, drops full trout, gets fully naked, and then invites the Netflix camera crew in there. He's, this just confirms to me Valtteri's working with, some he's working with some heavy material. He really has that confidence. So I'm glad we got a Valtteri episode though, and I'm glad it highlighted his performance at Russia in the third ep, because also the man is so bad at keeping a secret. The whole time they're like, "Did you do it on purpose?" And he's like, "Well, if I did, that stays with me." And it's like, well, that's only something that you would say if you had done it on purpose. So I think you might have done it on purpose. But yeah, I think it was cool to sort of highlight that tension between him and Lewis that exists there a lot. And I'm glad that they sort of painted him as the skilled driver that he is, because there's a reason that he's with Mercedes, and there's a reason that he's always number 2. It's not like you can just put anyone in the Mercedes and they'll do amazing. But I guess speaking of that, one of the biggest notes that I think we've all had probably is that there's no George Russell episode of plopping him in the Mercedes and him doing extremely well. So, bit disappointed there. Netflix, I don't know how we possibly skipped over that underdog story. We knew Netflix was there at that race, but I guess they decided they were just mostly going to follow Checo. I don't know. But I think it was certainly an interesting choice to not get the full scope of that Sakir Grand Prix and show, maybe one episode from Checo's point of view as this great, incredible victory, and one from the devastating loss of George Russell. I don't know if Netflix doesn't think that George Russell is a great selling point for an episode or what, but they're sorely mistaken. I think people would love an episode on George Russell. Just look at him. My other notes of the season were that Cyril looked great. I think he had a quarantine glow up or something. Maybe it's the hair, but his skin looked younger. He looked more in shape. He had a full head of hair. He really looked like he was thriving, especially post Danny Rick breakup. He got that revenge body. Cyril did. Yeah, that was the other great line of the show was after, they announced in the show, obviously, that Danny Rick is leaving Renault and going to McLaren. They, cut to Cyril and his talking head, and he just, says, of course I was torn up about it. I am Latin. I am French. I'm an emotional man. I was hurt by it. And, They really framed it like a real breakup for the two of them. It was very intense. But I loved seeing that side of Cyril, and I loved seeing his post-quarantine and post-breakup glow-up happen. I think it was also really interesting to sort of highlight the first episode. They focused mainly on the canceled GP in Australia and, how the mood was in the paddock with all of these rumors going on of coronavirus and stuff, and sort of having this, this lens of dramatic irony the entire time, right? They're showing, these radio clips of people being like, thankfully it doesn't spread easily. And then obviously now in 2021, we're like, oh, what a quote. And then of course, people saying, oh, I've heard people at McLaren have it. I heard, if someone, I think Lance Stroll says, I feel like this whole paddock is going to just blow up soon with this virus. And Carlos Sainz being like, yeah, if any one of us gets it, this whole thing is over. And just the dramatic irony of those scenes of knowing what's to come and them not knowing is insane. I also want to highlight, it's interesting in these scenes to see how the younger drivers, I think they focus specifically on Lando, sort of have to stick to the script of approving of whatever the FIA and Formula One does. So, they like show him getting ready for a press briefing, and if he's asked about the virus, to just be like, yeah, well, you know, if the FIA and Formula One say that it's okay to race, then we're okay to race. And just having to put their full trust in it because they're such a young driver. Obviously, they don't want to badmouth Formula One and the FIA, versus Lewis being very outspoken, and sort of his position of power and his ability to speak up on that behalf and say, like, yeah, I'm shocked that we're here right now. This seems incorrect. And we're only really here so that people can still make money, but this is putting everyone here in jeopardy. And seeing the contrast in the first episode was actually really cool. My other note of the show was that obviously every time Alex Albon was on screen, I wanted to cry. It was so sad. It's really sad to sort of watch it back and like see his performances, and, you know, obviously how he was robbed by Lewis in the exact same way as the Brazil GP of his podium. You know, having that happen twice, insane. And then, of course, like, knowing what's going to happen at the end of the season already, and just having to watch Alex go through this season and, you know, fight tooth and nail to try to get that podium and prove his worth to Christian Horner when you know what happens. It's just heartbreaking. But yeah, they had a lot of focus on Alex, a lot of focus on Lando this year, which was interesting, and I think that, you know, good to highlight those drivers. They also highlighted Seb leaving Ferrari, obviously, and the timing of his information drop, which was absolute king shit. That was iconic. They also highlighted Carlos leaving McLaren, and they kind of wove in this narrative of there being like a lot of tension between him and Lando specifically. From what I saw, I don't think that was necessarily the case. It seemed to me that it was more just, you know, if anything, maybe some tension between Carlos and like the team, because he's gonna leave, so obviously they have to prioritize him less. But like, I don't think that they like tried to play off that one clip of like Carlos kicking the chair out from under Lando as like some like very serious like offense, and like something like that, like they were genuinely fighting. It just seemed like guys being dudes to me. It just seemed like you know, you playing a prank on your bud. It was a bit silly. I think that's the overall thing is, you know, and this is the main complaint I've been seeing on Twitter, is that Netflix will obviously over dramatize some moments to, you know, increase watchability for people that don't know Formula One, but ultimately it's not really in line with what's Formula One fans know to be true. And so it's a bit surreal to be watching as a Formula One fan and, you know, see these dramatic edits and be like, is this really something that happened? Or is this just like not from the same race even, you know, when they show people like turning their shoulders to give someone like a dirty look or something. Like, are we sure that was from this interaction, or was that just like candid footage that you had on hand? You know, those kinds of things. So I think lastly I wanted to talk about the episode about Roman Grosjean and his crash. I think they called it Man on Fire or whatever. It's the second to last episode of the season. And as much as I hate the dramatic editing that sometimes happens here, and, you know, to some extent it felt kind of tacky, but I understand why they wanted to build that tension, right? Because, like, I think that it was fairly accurate to what people felt on race day, even though it was only, like, less than 20 seconds of the crash happening to him getting out. You know, that felt like an eternity as you were waiting for updates and you weren't sure what was going to happen when you were actually watching the race. And, you know, it makes sense to kind of recreate that in the Netflix version, and just sort of, you know, pan away from the crash and show people's reactions and their fears, and that they were pitting and that they were all watching on screens, very concerned. So I understand why they did that. I don't know if it was maybe the most tasteful way they could have done it, but it makes sense why they did it that way. And I think the rest of the episode was pretty beautiful, just showing him and Marion and having them like talk about it together, and having him kind of allude to like, you know, this was the best way he could have left Formula One and retired, was sort of as this the symbol of, you know, how far F1 technology has come and the effectiveness of, you know, things like the halo and stuff like that. The fact that he could survive a crash like that is incredible, and to have your name live on, you know, demonstrating that is probably the best way he would want to leave Formula One. So I understand that totally. And it's cute that, you know, how many times he mentioned his family and going home to them. So yeah, I thought it was very sweet, very heartwarming. I did cry a little bit. Yeah, especially when he was going out to like see the like fire marshals and the first aid who helped him out. That was definitely heartwarming. But yeah, those were my general thoughts on Formula One Drive to Survive. I hope that we weren't too repetitive in our thoughts, and that you know, we each presented kind of a unique perspective and ideas on these. Thank you so much for listening. Please, for more Formula One content, especially now that the season is starting, feel free to check out our socials. We are at BoxBoxBox Podcast on TikTok and Instagram, and at BoxBoxBoxPod on Twitter. So check us out there. Maybe give us a follow. Hopefully we'll have some good memes incoming for the start of the season. This week is race week. We've got our first race out in Bahrain again. So very excited for that. That's what next week's episode will be about. So stay tuned for that as well. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. Bye.